I'm John Wilker, the organizer of 360 IDEP. I hope you enjoy this session recording, but first I wanted to mention one thing. We've served the community since 2009, and over the past few years we've had to take on debt in an effort to keep the conference alive. After several unforeseen challenges, not the least of which is a pandemic of indefinite duration, we've had to make the hard choice to end the conference as we're now facing over $100,000 in debt. As a result of requests from the community of how they can help, we've created a GoFundMe campaign. If you're inclined and able, please consider donating to help keep 360 IDEP going. The QR code after this will link you to the campaign. Thank you. Enjoy the recording.
Good morning. How's everybody doing today? We're not going to talk about Xcode, so there you go. You're all free to go. No. So hi, my name is James Dempsey. If you joined us for Stump last night, you know that my band is James Dempsey and the Breakpoints. If you did come out, I hope you enjoyed yourselves yesterday. A couple of other things that I do. I maintain and run swiftversion.net because I always get confused what dot release we're currently on, what we're working on, and which Xcode versions go with which versions of Swift. So you can just go there and do that. I also create build setting extractor, the free utility to drag and drop your Xcode project and spit out a bunch of XC config files, which is nice. You may have known that swift.org, the website, was open sourced this spring. And I also this spring got to be, or asked to be a member of the website work groups. That's another thing I do. And I don't know if you all saw the Swift programming language book was open sourced yesterday, which is cool. So if there are things you have always wanted to change about it, you can make pull requests. And these, of course, are all part of James Dempsey's cavalcade of profitless pursuits. But we're here to talk about Xcode. Xcode, you know it, you love it, you hate it, you wish you knew it better, sometimes you wish you never met it at all. And we know that it's a complex app because it meets the modern criteria for a complex app. On a 14-inch MacBook, the menu items go on the other side of the notch. But what are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk about Xcode. What I'm going to talk through is possibly a slightly oversimplified mental model of software development, and then map the pieces of Xcode's UI and files on disk to that mental map. And for me at least, then we're going to take a look at that mental model and look at a new thing, well, not that new at this point, added to Xcode to see if our model works, and along the way, maybe a little bit of Xcode history. So this oversimplified model of software development, we think we do a lot when we're developing software, but at a very high level, especially from Xcode's perspective looking at us, we really only do 4 things, right? We get a bunch of files exactly the way we want them with our, bespoke type names, and get that icon file exactly right. So we get these source files in exactly the way we want them. We define a recipe for how we're going to turn those source files into some piece of software. And that's actually where we do most of our work. Then we actually hit the button, and all of those dominoes that we set up in the first 2 steps, we build a piece of software, hopefully. If not, back to the first 2 steps. And then finally, somewhere along the line, we're going to run the software. So you could think of it as like we edit, we configure, we build, and then we run. I prefer not to use those labels because we're not always editing. We might be generating source files that end up being built. We may end up doing different things, especially that last one, run. I prefer to use the word evaluate, right? Because as soon as you run the software, one way or another, you're evaluating it. Whether you're debugging it to see exactly what happens, whether you're running tests to see if they pass, but even if you're in QA, you're evaluating to see if things work as expected. But even any user, any customer, you get a piece of software, 1 star, this app sucks. So it's always evaluated. Whether they write a review or not, mentally, you can't help but evaluate the thing you're using. And so Xcode really pretty strictly maps to these 4 items. So how's this useful? There's a question. Why don't I go next door? Xcode is an incredibly complex product, right? There is so much going on. There's so many different file types that it can edit. There's so many different settings in the build configurations. There's so many different things in a scheme. There's so many different ways we can debug. We can go into the memory debugger, the view debugger. We can run this. There's all this going on. And it can get a little daunting, overwhelming. For me, being able to think of something, know, okay, oh, there's a new feature in Xcode. Which bucket is it in? And as soon as I know that, I pretty much can map to, this is probably going to be here in Xcode. And so that's what we'll walk through today. So first of all, Xcode's user interface, we know it. It's got that classic 3-panel, right? The sidebar, you select something in the sidebar, the correct editor pops up, and then you select something in the editor and the inspector pops up, and it's all contextual. And of course, when I make my changes, pick another file type, different editor pops up. There's a lot of different file types, so Xcode has a lot of different editors. What's this, 5 different ways we can edit a file just in a basic UIKit iOS app template. That's a lot of complexity. But all of that is really in the first 2 steps. And also, the other thing is when you're selecting those, your editor menu also changes based on what kind of file you have selected. And so that sidebar really has an enormous amount of power in Xcode. This notion that I can select something on the left, things pop up on the right that are appropriate, and then I get more detail in the inspector, really maps to a vast number of things. So Xcode actually uses this pretty wisely. Of course, we're only looking at one of the tabs in that sidebar. There are 9 things that we can make that sidebar do. So we're going to talk about each one a bit. So let's go back to our buckets here, and let's just look very briefly at source. So of course, we already saw in the project navigator, you pick a file, a source file, you can edit it. And then in terms of how that's represented on disk, it's also pretty straightforward. It's very close to how it's just appearing in the file system by default. Of course, Xcode, you can go in and refer to a file over here and a file over there. But by default, it's mapping what's in the file system in terms of your source files to what's in your project. So we won't spend too much time there. Let's take a look at item number 2, this configuration, which is very, I don't want to say misleading. We select a project in the project navigator, and every single thing about building every single target in that project is editable in this edit pane. Build set, which targets we have, what kind of targets they are, what are their dependencies, build settings, build phases, it's all in here. And everything in here and everything going on in that project navigator Where's that on disk? Well, we know because we use source control that Xcode proj is just a wrapper, and there's stuff inside. And of course, well, I don't know, of course. For me, it's of course, because I've looked into it. The one spot where all of that lives is the project.pbxproj file, which is probably best known for merge conflicts. So really from Xcode, the core of Xcode is doing those first two steps, getting our source files the way we want them, getting the recipe of how to put them together into something, and then actually having that happen. In other words, building the stuff in your project is really at the core of Xcode. Now, how do I know this? Because building a project is exactly what Xcode used to be called, Project Builder. Now, Project Builder is so old that that is a blurry icon because the highest resolution icon available is 128 by 128. And Project Builder came along from Next when Apple purchased Next. Apple rewrote it around the time of Mac OS X. That was also the time when they loved putting X's on everything. So internally, and it leaked out to some degree, it was known as Project Builder 10 or X. So PBX, that's why it's a PBXproj file. It's not peanut butter extreme. It's a PBXproj, and the format, the basic format of that file actually precedes Xcode by a number of years. So when we dig into a PBXproj file, we're not going to go through line by line, but we have references to files, just like we see in the Project Navigator. We see the definition of targets, just like we see when we edit a project's targets. And then we see build configurations, which literally have every single build setting in your PBXproj file, which is why there's a big ellipsis in the middle there. And they're named. Literally, build configurations are just named dictionaries of key value pairs. So that's where it lives on disk, project.pbproj. Let me go back for a second. The summary here is that everything in the Project Navigator and everything when you edit a project and its targets, it's all in that one file. And so if anything is happening in your project that deals with these first two buckets, you're pretty much looking at the Project Navigator and editing the project or its files. Like, all of Xcode is there, but you're pretty much dealing with that one section. There are two more tabs that deal with these two areas that are kind of ancillary but helpful. There's the Find Navigator, which finds stuff in your project and also in your project definitions, your build settings, as well as your files. And the Symbol Navigator, who here uses the Symbol Navigator? Yay! I just don't use it. And it's nothing against the Symbol Navigator. I use it on occasion, but you know, we had two folks. That's two folks out of this room of Xcode users. That seems worthy of a whole tab up there, doesn't it? So as we march down, there's 3 of the 9. And I just want to point out that no matter how much work we do in these first 2 phases, we haven't created any software yet. We just have a bunch of files on disk. We haven't built a darn thing. These first 2 steps are pretty much about like setting up all the dominoes. And then starting the build is like tapping that first domino and it all happens. So let's move on. So the back half of these four, there's building and evaluating, running, however we want to call it. So these, well, let me just, for a moment, Apple and Xcode combines these two steps into one thing called a scheme. Because to do anything with the software that you're trying to build, you actually have to build it. And it makes no sense to build your software and then just never run it. So combining the two into one build and run makes sense. Now you'd think something as important as like the back half of these four things would get a tab somewhere, but they don't. It pretty much gets the toolbar. Why is it in the toolbar? Maybe that's because where the action happens. We have a handy run button that we can just click. We can choose between schemes there. That's possibly why it isn't in a sidebar. So the toolbar is really about, once we have everything set up, making stuff happen. So first the build. And when we edit a scheme, which is a combination of a build and some action, note at this point, we don't get to change how something gets built. We just get to pick what gets built. So all of the recipe of how this is going to become a piece of software, that's not here. That's in the project navigator. This is what targets are you going to build, for what actions are you going to build what targets. And of course, the build phase is one of the phases where we only use the user interface when things go terribly wrong. The issue navigator, of course, if our build fails, we'll go there to look at our issues. It also shows up in the report navigator, where we can really drill down each step of the build. We can look at errors, but we can also look at every particular step and what command line was run to make that happen. So building gets us two more. But again, building without doing anything with the software, why'd you bother? So it's this last step, which we know is not just one step. There's a lot of things we're going to do with our software, right? Run, test, profile, analyze, archive. Some of it's stuff we're going to do to try to improve or figure out why our software, or check if our software is doing what we expect it to, or investigate why our software isn't doing what we expect it to. But then there's that archive step, which is take this software, get it ready to give to other people, whether they be QA folks, beta testers in test flight, your actual users and customers. But all of those folks are going to be evaluating the software one way or another. And of course, we know that run is kind of a misnomer because it's really debug. Because by default, it's going to run with the debugger on. And I'm not going to belabor, but of course, when we go in to edit a scheme, we're able to pick for each of these actions a lot of options, how we want that to launch when it launches. The main build thing that we get to choose is which build configuration we're going to use. So I'll pop through these. So these schemes, where the heck do they live? Well, they're not, very definitely not, in the project.pbx file. PBXproj file. Can you imagine if every time somebody on your team wanted to change, like, oh, I'm going to enable a debug log when I run this app, and then it gets checked into the project file, oh my gosh, that would be awful. Every little time, because especially as Teams gets bigger, the number of folks in automated systems that are doing things to the software to evaluate it in various ways. Different people are working on different features. They might have different flags turned on. They might have different things set up. The fact that your project and its targets and how we build it is separate in the file system than defining what you're going to do with it once it's built is incredibly useful. And so they sneak these things away. They each have a scheme file. There's XC user data, and there's in there, every user can have their own folder in there. And in XC schemes, it's an XC scheme file. There's also the shared data with XC schemes, same idea. Here's what an XC scheme, this is the beginning of one. Essentially, every setting that you see in the UI ends up somewhere in this XML. It's a pretty direct mapping. It's not too scary. Just want to go back to mention one thing, which is Xcode also has this nice ability to make certain things shared or just unique to you, the user. So if you are working on a particular thing in your code and you need all of these different debug flags turned on, you don't have to spam your whole team with that. You could not check the XC user data into source control, but you're able to share among your team, check it into source control, anything in XC shared data, and you're able to make that choice, which is kind of nice. I think sometimes we overlook that. Also, it means that we can be very selective about what we share, potentially. And we have infinite ability to make up our own schemes locally that work for us without ever spamming source control, causing merge conflicts. It's like our own little place to be. Now, debug actually ends up getting two tabs, right? There's the breakpoint navigator, my personal favorite, the breakpoint navigator, and the debug navigator, which it seems every year or two gets another little button down in the bottom there of like another thing we can debug visually, which is very cool. And then the test action gets its own tab. Where are we? Yeah, and so we can see all of those tests. And so we're pretty much walked through, segregated everything into those buckets, except for the source control tab, because that's a little bit of a special case. Because really, when we think about it, source control, if you think of it just in terms of source code, is a bit of a misnomer, because all of these things, except the build step, really, you never check your build product into source control, are things you want to share with teammates. You don't want everybody to have their own build settings. Oh. And so the source control navigator really hits on 1, 2, and 4, right? So here I edited a scheme file that's shared, and I'm going to check that in. If there are project changes, those will show up. And then if there are source file changes, those will show up. And that's pretty much the walkthrough of how those all map and where they live in the file system. So hopefully you kind of have an idea of, well, if it's this, it's probably here and it's in this file and this is where I should look for it. Now, one thing I want to note is that, you know, as I've given the talk, I've mentioned, like, it seems like there are very strong boundaries between these. But that's not exactly true, right? There are cases where things are a little fuzzy. So like the info.plist file, that is a source file that gets copied into your project, actually gets generated in part by what's in the build setting values. So it's kind of step 2 influencing step 1 retroactively. We also sometimes have things in our project that are not source files, right? If you create a test plan, that ends up in your project along with all your source files, but it doesn't get compiled. It only gets used when you're testing. Same thing with Xcode files. If you, say, use build setting extractor and pull out a set of Xcode files, which lets you pull the config information out of your proj file and reduce the potential number of merge conflicts there, they're going to be in the project navigator, which again, they don't get compiled. Of course, just about all the actions visually report back or refer back to source code. We can always see what's being debugged and what have you. And then script phases can really blur the lines. So I mentioned that, by the time you get to a scheme, you're pretty much done. You can't affect what's being built. Well, it's true, except you can have a pre-action for a build, which can be any arbitrary script. So you could potentially, in a scheme, do all sorts of stuff right before you build, if you need to. So again, these buckets are not meant to be, they're meant to be a mental model to help us so that we can see where it fits and where it doesn't. That's that, and I think I forgot, I have a slide in here that I'd missed, but you'll have to trust me because I won't be able to show you. So it's going to see how well this mental model works on a newer feature. So they added the ability to, what did they add? To add Swift packages as dependencies when you're building something a couple years ago. So first, which bucket would that be in? Shout it out. What's that?
I missed the question.
So Swift packages as something that your project or target can depend on. What bucket would that be in? What's that? You say the first one? You think it's 2? First and third. All right, well, I think in the end, note that when we, say it's some Swift package that we're pulling down from GitHub, it's a dependency of our target. It's not part of our target. It's not our source code. So it ends up, it's a configuration of your target that, this target's going to use this package. And so if we know that, where would we expect to find the configuration information for packages that our project's using? The PBX project file, and indeed, that's exactly where it is. And in fact, when you choose one of these build plugins that Ellen was talking about yesterday, also that is another little configuration in your PBX proj file. And you're right that it comes into play in that all the dependencies are built when you hit build. But in terms of the configuration of it, it's definitely step 2. It's kind of like importing a framework or a library. It's another dependency that you're not editing directly. All right. And that's, we don't talk about Xcode. And I think we have time for some questions if anybody has any. I hope it's been helpful. Yes.
Looks like we can get into that. I had a bit of an expert. I think it's trying to build it. How did that build?
I have no idea. Well, the question is, it seems like we're getting an iPad version of Xcode. I think what we're seeing more is that Swift Playgrounds, where you can build an app, but it does have limitations, might have less and less limitations over time. But I would imagine that what that progresses into may not look exactly like Xcode. But it's hard to say because we don't know what Apple's going to do till they do it. And then even then, we don't necessarily know what they did. Yes?
So I'm looking for yet another opinion on what to include and not include in your Git repo.
Gotcha. Well, my understanding is the intent is that things that are shared, you've shared them because you want to share them, and therefore they should be in your Git repo. Things that are not shared, if you wanna, but you don't have to. But shared stuff is probably intended to be shared. That's, yes?
As you've seen Xcode evolve over the years, do you see this like here as where they're going next year? And if so, you have feel
Oh, any feels of, like, having seen the dots of Xcode progress over the years, do I have a feel for what's coming next year? Well, one of the biggest ways, we now have a bit of insight because Swift evolution is open. So very often we'll see stuff introduced in Swift or Swift Package Manager, and then that gives us a hint, like, they'll probably add this in Xcode. It might be this year or 5 years from now, but they will probably add. But other than that, very often things that show up in Xcode are like show up because they're supporting some new thing. Like before Scene or Reality Kit was announced, you wouldn't expect a Reality Kit editor or anything like so. No, one thing, the thing I've tried to do over the years is try to guess less and less what's coming. And I don't mean that like in a bad way. It just, since I don't have any control over what's happening, and if I have my own expectations that aren't met, I'm going to be disappointed about something that I had no really reason to be disappointed about. And in the end, you know, Apple is a big company and they're going to do what they're going to do. And I can file feedbacks and make angry tweets, but for the most part, they're going to do what they're going to do. So I just try to kind of hope a little, but not too much, because I don't want to be disappointed. And largely just hope, you know, whatever comes out is better than what I have. Learned helplessness, I think it's called. Any other questions? Yes?
So, I see this thing logging my processor all night called XCP build service.
It's called what?
XCP build service.
I don't know what that is, but I'm guessing it's building things. But I honestly don't. Is there any rhyme or reason as to, is it any rhyme or reason as to when it spins up? It's I mean, they're probably trying to do stuff in the background, so it's probably Xcode's driving it, but it's, yeah, that would be my guess, but I don't know for certain. Any other questions? Yes?
Even on the fancy environment, every time I open Xcode, it will try to index my project again and again. Why cannot, like, isn't there a better way?
You know how I hope for better things in the next version of Xcode? That, well, and like for me, it's, hey, maybe, you know, generated interfaces shouldn't take that many seconds to load for frameworks everybody's using all the time. But yeah, that sounds more like a feedback file to Apple, which they do, they tally them up and work on stuff. They do.
I'm just curious to be sure that technical reason why changes come out consistent.
I don't, it, sometimes, like, especially with something as complex as Xcode, I'm not, you can never ever be sure whether there's actually a good reason for something happening or whether like there's just a bug. And it's really hard to tell. Or if there's like a really obscure technical and it's bugging them too, but they have to get this thing fixed before they can fix this thing. So it's really hard to tell from the outside. But I do encourage people to file feedback. Like it feels like they're never looking at it, but they look at it. Any other questions? Yes.
So over the years, Xcode has become increasingly monolithic, and we used to have a folder full of development tools, and now we pretty much just have Xcode and instruments.
Yeah.
Do you feel like the convenience of the monolithic way of doing things justifies sort of like the performance issues of having a bunch of little developer tools? Like, do you think that trend is something good, or do you feel like that's just making it harder for everything?
That's a good question. The question is, what's my opinion about Xcode becoming more monolithic? We used to have different tools, like Interface Builder was separate than Xcode. I liked it being separate personally. I think, well, just looking at that initial project where there were 5 different editors, like I think having a separate JSON editor, a separate property list editor, a separate asset catalog editor, that doesn't necessarily make sense, but there might be some kind of high level, like interface builder, might have been nice to keep that the same. Although then you end up with problems that they're having with inter-process communication, trying to keep the two in sync. I think a lot of things do fit into that 3-panel. And so if it's plugin based, I think considering the amount of stuff they've done, it's a pretty nice app considering all that it does. And I also think that with instruments, they've recognized that this isn't going to work in our usual 3-panel thing. It's its own app. And there are a couple of other apps like Accessibility Verifier and Pixie, that are separate apps, but they're much fewer and far between. But it's not something that I've been too upset over that IB went away. Any other questions? Yes.
Look at tools like List or Xcode Gen for just sort of running the whole file.
I've glanced at them, especially when working on build setting extractor. I always find that like when you go, it's my opinion that when you go off the beaten path, you get some advantages, but then you pick up some disadvantages, but it's a smaller set of people experiencing those disadvantages. And so you probably have a better chance of those disadvantages going away at some point if you stick to the beaten path. And that's just been my own personal leaning. It's kind of personal preference. I know some folks love to be off the beaten path. When it comes to dev stuff, I tend to be on the path. Like people will post things, I'm like, why would you even think to do that? But that's a good question. Yes? To Xcode Gen? Okay, cool. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much.